Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome former Congresswoman Gabrielle Giffords, accompanied by Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz, to lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, liberty and justice for all.
Some might say Gabby Giffords is lucky. Just over 18 months ago, the former Arizona Congresswoman was shot in the head by a 22-year-old college dropout outside a supermarket in Tucson. Few expected her to survive, let alone be well enough to recite the Pledge of Allegiance at the Democratic National Convention last month. 6 others weren't so lucky. They died in the same murderous hail of gunfire that targeted Giffords. 13 others shot that day are still recovering. Anyone who watched her couldn't help thinking of the 12 people who died and the 58 who were injured in a murderous rampage 5 weeks earlier at a movie theater in Aurora, Colorado. And that horrific tragedy was followed by another, a shooting on August 5th at a Sikh temple near Milwaukee. In that one, 6 innocents were killed and 4 wounded. Many Americans are wondering whether our society is sadly prone to these acts of evil. Since 1982 in the United States, there have been at least 60 such acts of mass murder, defined by criminologists as the deaths of more than 4 people at the hands of a stranger in a single act of violence.
What's going on out there? He turned the gun straight at us and shot. And my God, the window went out. And the kid standing there with me, I think he got hit. We got help on the way, ma'am. Okay.
Could they have been prevented? Finding an answer means taking a closer look at those who perpetrate these killings. Were they mad? That is to say, clinically insane? Were they cold-hearted murderers who knew exactly what they were doing? Or some combustible mixture of both? Today on Criminal Justice Matters, we're honored to have 2 of the country's foremost experts on extreme criminal violence to help us work through these questions. Abby Stein is an associate professor at John Jay College. She's written over 30 articles on subjects such as criminal psychopathology and child abuse, and is author of the noteworthy book Prologue to Violence. She serves as director of the John J. Vera Institute Fellows Program. Dr. Michael Stone is a professor of clinical psychiatry at Columbia, who specializes in personality disorders. His research on mass killers led to a book called The Anatomy of Evil and a Discovery Channel series on serial and mass murderers. So, Dr. Stone, let me start with you. Welcome to both of you. But let me start with you, Dr. Stone. I wanted to get your take on a very interesting comment that somebody made just after the shootings, who was an eyewitness in Aurora. And she said she looked at the killer, the alleged killer, and said he seemed so calm. What do you make of that?
Well, I think he had planned long in advance to do what he was doing. He would be trapped, as we all know, in the apartment, hoping that he would kill some more people, particularly policemen who would enter the apartment after the massacre. So he was, in that respect, at ease with himself at doing what he was about to do. And I think that accounts for the impassive face, which, by the way, was very similar to the impassive face of Anders Breivik in Oslo a year ago, this past July, who killed 69 people in that little island with absolute no expression whatever. He felt totally justified in what he was doing. And I think Holmes, in his own odd way, felt justified as well.
Is the impassivity a mask for concealing his real feelings, or are they basically deep down not feeling anything?
Well, I think both are true to some extent. The first thing I want to point out is that this goes so much against the stereotype of what a mass murderer is. We tend to think that of somebody who's going berserk, who has a trigger, and then the common term lately is go postal. And yet, these crimes are often meticulously planned. They're very premeditated. And I think Michael Stone calls it exactly correctly when he talks about the kind of calm and impassivity that really signals having put all the pieces in order and now knowing that the crime can be executed with a great deal of thoroughness and success.
Dr. Stone, for your book, Anatomy of Evil, you interviewed more than 200 of these mass murderers. Is there a common thread that you found among them all that can tell us a little bit more about them?
I don't think there's a common thread, because I think the mass murderers who kill a number of people at once are, first of all, they're not all the same, but many of them partake of the qualities you just mentioned, where they may have been triggered or set in motion by some reversal in life, a humiliation, a job rejection, a lover rejection, but then they plan very methodically to do what they're going to do on the day that they execute their mass murder. Serial killers are a different breed. They're motivated by sexual desires of an abnormal sort, and they're really, so they're different, and then they kill one at a time with an interval of time in between, which is why they call it serial. So there might be a week, a month, several months between murder 2 and murder 1. And as I say, they're motivated by a variety of different beginning situations, hatred of women, whatever it may be, but they nevertheless have a sexual problem that motivates their killing. Mass murderers, that's not very often the case.
They're overwhelmingly male. Does that say anything?
Of course. Mass murderers in my series are 97% male. Serial sexual homicide is by definition a male phenomenon, because a woman isn't going to be aroused and want every so often to commit a lust murder. It's exceedingly rare, for a woman to behave in that way. The only two I can think of are Jane Toppen in the 19th century and the Countess Erzsébet Báthory in Hungary in the 16th century, who actually pressed her bodies against the bodies of the virgins that her employees would find in the wayside and hang up on hooks in the castle, and she would press her body against their body as their bodies were being slit and bleeding, and she would experience orgasm. That's very rare. So it's really a male phenomenon. I think it has to do with testosterone, with the difference in how males are wired psychologically from females. We're the ones who, after all, guard the perimeter in the ancient tribes that we all came from. The women are in the middle, feeding the babies and cooking for the guys and so on. They're more affiliative, more friendly in general. Men tend to stand more apart. So that the psychology is different, and the way in which lust operates is different in men than in women, and that, I think, accounts for the fact that serial sexual homicide is a guy thing, and mass murder is, for all intents and purposes, a guy thing.
A guy thing.
Well, one of the few things we know about violence in general is that the best predisposing factor for committing it is having a Y chromosome. That's across the board in all cultures.
Right.
But it's very interesting if you separate out the serial killings, which do have this alternative kind of motivation, and you look just as the mass murders, even though again a stereotype is that these are killings that generally take place in public places where many strangers are murdered randomly, that isn't the vast majority of mass murders. About 80% are committed against family members or acquaintances, people that you know from the workplace or people that you go to school with. So the profile there tends to be very testosterone laden, and we don't know as much about motivation as we would like, because most of the mass murderers die during their assaults. Yeah. They either commit suicide or they are killed by police, and even the killings by police may be what we call suicide by police,
yes, sure.
where they want to go out in a blaze of glory.
I want to get back to the motivation in a second, but something that you quoted in one of your works really fascinating me, which was that murder, the act of murder is not an act, it's not a single event in itself, but the result of a series of covert internal processes that may have started back in childhood. That's a general analysis of murder or murderers, not necessarily mass murderers. But is there anything that particularly applies in that to a mass murderer?
I think these, the kinds of emotions that eventually result in murders have their seeds very often in childhood. Now, while this may not be quite applicable to a profile of a mass murderer, certainly the single homicide perpetrators that I've interviewed tend to share a history very, very often of neglect and abuse. So there's been an early sort of set piece for relationships that involves the expression of attachment through some kind of violence that festers over time. It becomes a model for interaction with other people. I think that the withdrawal from other pro-social forms of being in society also goes on over a long period of time. There are withdrawals from what you might call normal activity.
So does it require a triggering event?
It very often has a triggering event. In the case of mass murders, that can be divorce, that can be unemployment. Look at all the workplace shootings we have. In the schools with younger perpetrators, it is often that they have endured a long period of bullying by their classmates. They've been made fun of, they've been called names, and slowly but surely this festers, and the idea, the fantasy of revenge takes hold.
We obviously don't know yet what motivated Jared Loughner or James Holmes, but do we have a sense that there was a particular...
I think. Loughner is a special... Loughner, by the way, I quite agree with what Dr. Stein was saying. These men are usually failures. They're flops. Holmes in Aurora failed. He was somebody who had no friends. He had all the criteria for schizotypal personality. The odd speech, odd thought, odd facies, and so on, inability to make sustained sexual partnerships or even friendships, and then failed his exams, and that was the trigger for him to begin, I'm going to get back at these SOBs, etc. With Loughner, Loughner came from a family where, as far as we can tell, there were bipolar relatives, somewhat distant relatives, but nevertheless there was some risk genes floating around, probably in him as well, for manic depression. And then, at 14, he suffered a romantic disappointment, rejection by a girlfriend. At that point, he began to abuse everything in the book. Marijuana, which has profound effects on adolescents in comparison to people who start for the first time in their late 20s, alcohol, LSD, mushrooms, cocaine, and salvia.
So this gets us to one of the key questions, that if we know a little bit about what happened in the circumstances leading up to Loughner's act, or people like him, is there anything predictive in their behavior that we can then use and say, we can prevent this from happening, whether it's access to guns, to drugs, or whatever else? Do you see any possibility?
Well, you know, this is where you have a real civil liberties problem, because there's a low base rate of this crime. There are many more people who would show the supposedly predictive qualities that would help you to profile them than will really ever commit a violent act. So in other words, half of all people get divorced. We have 8% unemployment. 100% of teenage boys are moody. Those might be qualities that could predict some sort of violence, but you can't go out and arrest all those people.
Their Facebook.
Right. Well, exactly. So I think there are real problems. Certainly, it would be helpful if there was more access to mental health services on campuses, and I think we are starting to move in that direction. Our own college here has recently put in a behavioral identification program to try to spot people who are in trouble. And yet you have many perpetrators who were taking medication, who were being seen by therapists at the time that they committed their crimes. Cho in the Virginia Tech massacre, Harris in Columbine. these were people who had been identified as having some sort of problem, some indication. Even, I think Klebold wrote a story for his English class saying, I'm going to blow everybody up. And the teacher wrote on the paper, great characters, wonderful details, and
so
perhaps it got an A.
Very quickly, if we predict, can we prevent?
No. Unless you have gun unless you have no guns, and there's most mass murder, and it's different from serial killers, which are often done by strangling and so on, and knife wounds. But mass murder is a gun thing almost exclusively. There's some number of people who use a bomb or fire, but that's rare. Most of them are guns. In our country, with 2 guns for every 3 people, there will never be anything done about guns. I just came from lecturing about Breivik in Oslo and Stockholm, where it's just about impossible to get a gun. And in Norway, I looked at mass murders around the world, 1,300 cases since the 1800s. Norway's had none except Breivik. But Breivik joined a gun club, pretending he wanted to be a marksman, etc., so they let him have a gun. Other than that, he could never have gotten a gun. In our country, anybody can get a gun. And unless you do something, and it's not even a question of making it harder to get an AK-47 or a semi-automatic rifle, because if you make a law saying no more can be imported, no more can be sold, fine. There's a zillion that are still around that you can get illegally, so that you can't prevent these people that you can't even spot, usually loners who are secretly planning to do something, and they have a gun. Unless you do something about the guns, forget about it. So I think we're going to have to live with it, and it was an unfortunate comment on our country, but there you have it.
It is. Lots of food for thought there. Thanks to you both.
Thank you.
The first mass murder in U.S. history arguably occurred in 1780. A Connecticut drifter named Barnett Davenport killed a couple he was lodging with, then set their house on fire, killing the couple's 3 grandchildren. The act horrified Connecticut residents and possibly Davenport himself, who claimed to atone for his wickedness before he was hanged. But that was before the age of mass media. It's a truism that in our 24/7 internet era, mass murder has become a news commodity that both horrifies us and titillates us. Does the way we cover these events today contribute in any way to their recurrence? To help us explore that part of the issue, we've invited Robin Barton, a legal journalist. She spent more than 8 years as a prosecutor in the Manhattan District Attorney's Office. She blogs on criminal justice journalism for the Crime Report. Robin, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
You recently wrote in the Crime Report that by spending so much time and resources in covering these mass murders, particularly the ones in Milwaukee and the ones in Colorado, the media gave these people exactly what they wanted. Were they looking for, do you think, a sort of day in infamy?
I'm not a psychologist or an expert in the mental state of these guys, but I have to believe that someone, take James Holmes, the shooter in the Aurora, Colorado incident, I have to believe that someone who dresses himself up arguably in costume, portraying himself as a Joker-like person, who goes to the midnight screening of a very popular movie, armed to the hilt, and starts randomly shooting people, that at least part of that motivation seems to be attention, basic attention and glory, and that by spending days and hours and even weeks covering that event, you are glorifying the acts, and you are in some ways giving him one of the things that he may have wanted. In the Wisconsin shootings, it's a little bit of a different dynamic, because in that case, the shooter killed himself, so he wasn't around to sort of reap the benefits of his act, so to speak. So in that case, I don't think that the coverage glorified it necessarily.
But is there any alternative? Can we not cover these people or these acts?
Oh, clearly these are newsworthy events. I mean, clearly the media has to cover them. The question is to what extent? I mean, obviously, when an incident like this happens, there's sort of a rallying cry that you grab all the reporters available, you send them to cover various aspects of the story, and that's completely appropriate and understandable. I guess my question is, 3 days later, 4 days later, a week later, if you're still covering this event, and if there isn't arguably anything new that's happened, I think journalists at that point need to step back and ask themselves, why are we still writing about this? What is our motivation? Aren't there other things happening that we could be spending more time covering?
Well, isn't it important for our own mental health as a society to get to some sort of closure, so we know exactly, first of all, whether we can prevent these from happening again, but at least whether we can understand why these people did it?
I think that that's true, but I don't know that, at least certainly in the initial few days or weeks of reporting, that enough information is available at that point to enable the public or the victims and their families to have any sort of closure. James Holmes was arrested. His case will be going to trial. I think the point of closure is way down the road, and certainly when that trial happens, or if there should happen to be a guilty plea, those things should be covered.
Well, maybe there's a better way to cover it. I mean, I've heard of people who say that now when they go to the Dark Knight film, they now check all the exits of the theater where they're going to, as if it could happen again. I mean, that's really not a rational response.
I think maybe it's not a rational response, but I think it's a very human response, a very emotional response. I had a conversation with a friend of mine when I was writing that piece, and we were talking about what I was writing, and she said exactly the same thing that you did. Her and her husband went to see the movie, and without discussing it beforehand, without planning it, they both made a mental note of where the emergency exits were. Anytime someone moved or stood up during the movie, they were much more aware of it. And they didn't realize that they were even doing it until afterwards in the car ride home.
One thing that we don't do, perhaps, is, and this is for a very obvious reason, is that people don't really want to hear about it anymore, is that we don't look at the ways that you can prevent these things, or why, whatever motivated these killers, whether they were mad or bad, the access to the guns they had that used them. It used to be that it was by rote. Newspapers or the media would talk about gun laws or gun control laws.
Right.
In these two cases, gun control and gun issues, and we are in a campaign, hardly made a dent. I mean, can you explain that, or is it something that the press has just given up on?
I'm not sure that I know what the explanation is. I think there was some discussion as to whether these shootings meant that there needed to be changes in the gun laws. I think because, at least in the case of both shooters, they had legally obtained the guns. There was less of an outcry than if perhaps they had gotten the guns illegally in some way. But I'm not certain why there wasn't more of a focus on the gun aspect and the gun law aspect in these two particular incidents.
Does it change the fact that we now live in the internet age? You write for us as a blogger for our website. The first murder I mentioned in our introduction, the first mass murder in U.S. history, occurred before we had internet, before we had radio and TV. Does that make a difference, do you think? Has that accelerated, intensified the interest in these things, or is it just that prurient interest that makes them keep going?
I think that it has accelerated our interest. I think that there's always sort of been that phenomena of when there's a traffic accident, everyone slows down to watch. I think that that's just sort of human. Again, it's sort of human nature. But I think in this day and age, people's expectations as to media coverage are so heightened. It's almost like literally a shooting happens, and within hours, if not sooner, people are expecting not only coverage of the event, but fairly detailed reports, and in an ongoing manner. They want that initial report within an hour, then they want follow-ups, continual follow-ups. And I think it's sort of the people's desire to have all of this information and have it quickly that sort of feeds the media's fervor in providing all this information.
So should we give them what they want?
I don't know. I think not. I think we should give them some of what they want, but I think at some point editors and journalists need to sort of step back and say, have we covered this enough? Have we covered all the relevant angles? Is there anything new to tell in this story at this point? And if not, then they should move on to something else.
We like to frighten ourselves quite a bit.
We do, we do. Scary movies are still very popular, so.
But there is a difference when we talk about, and you mentioned the difference between the killings in the Sikh temple in Milwaukee and the killings in Aurora.
Yeah.
There is a political flavor, obviously, to what happened in Milwaukee. Those need to be covered in some sense. We were now going through the anti-Muslim film, another incidence of media being used for evil ends. I mean, so perhaps we need to concentrate on those issues where there's politics and ideology involved.
I would agree. I think there were a lot of elements. I think one reporter, in talking about the Oak Creek shootings, had said this was an example of domestic terrorism, and yet it wasn't really portrayed that way in the media. And certainly, if you look at the extent and the range of coverage that shooting got as compared to the Aurora shooting, there's no comparison. And I think that's another way in which sort of the media's relationship with the public is important. I think when the media continually covers an event, for an extended period of time and sort of throws all of its resources at it, I think that's signaling to the public that this is important and you need to know about that. And I think that's fine to some extent. But the flip of that is, by not covering a shooting such as the one in the Sikh temple to the same extent and with the same sort of fervor, you also run the risk that you're signaling to the public that this event was not that important and that you don't need to care as much about that. And I think it's a very dangerous message to be sending.
Robin, thanks very much.
Thank you for having me.
The healing has begun for the victims of this year's mass killings, but the scars will remain for them and for the relatives of the dead forever. As the rest of us must wonder when and where it will happen again, we're left with the same conundrum. Can we prevent these tragedies? Now that we're heading into the final days of the election, who has the courage to address this issue? I'm Steve Handelman. See you next time.